Hello, 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 hello. Is this on? Settle down. Hey. How's it going? For a popular request, please silence your phones and close your laptops. Per Dr. Euler. Okay, so thank you guys first and foremost for coming to our second Dean's Hour of the year. I have the very great pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker today, Mr. Adam Thompson. Mr. Thompson holds a degree in theology from Georgetown University. He began his career in public health as an outreach worker, utilizing web-based social networking platforms to reach gay and bisexual men who used to inject drugs. He currently serves as the regional partner director for the South Jersey partner of the Northeast Caribbean AIDS Foundation Education and Training Centers, and is the co-chair for the National Quality Forum's Primary Care and Chronic Illness Measure Endorsement Standing Committee, and also sits on their board of directors. As a person living with HIV, Adam brings both his professional and lived experience to the conversation. Mr. Thompson considers himself to be an advocate for the modernizing of healthcare and meaningful involvement of patients and consumers in the planning, delivering, and evaluating of care services. Being from Elkins, West Virginia, Mr. Thompson also enjoys mountains, sweet tea, and keeping it simple. I know a lot of you had the great pleasure of listening to Mr. Thompson speak last year, and he's been very gracious enough to return this year. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mr. Adam Thompson.
All right, good morning. Or I guess it's afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Is this loud enough in the back? Right? Cheap seats? Awesome. So I'm really excited to be here today. Traditionally, I start this lecture by talking about the HIV care continuum and sort of explaining the role of stigma and discrimination in HIV. However, there is something going on in our country right now that is killing more people than AIDS did annually at the height of the epidemic. Something that I think is sitting in your backyard, and that's the opioid epidemic. As I traveled around the country over the last couple years, it has convinced me that people do not know the story of what happened to our communities, which is why there's a lot of stigma and discrimination taking place for the people who are now suffering from opioid use disorder. So I want to begin this lecture by telling you a little bit of the timeline about how this happened to make sure that we all understand how this crisis came to be so that we can understand our frame that we've put on the people who are suffering in this. If you go back to 1980, which probably seems like a long time for some of you, but for me, I was a young guy living in Hurricane, West Virginia. At that time, there was a 5-sentence letter to the editor from the New England Journal of Medicine. In this 5 sentences, they reframed the entire view of narcotic usage in the United States of America. The statement that was drawn out and utilized later to convince physicians of the safety of opioids was this statement that the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. What they did not talk about was that this was hospital data. These were people who were managed in a hospital and then tapered off of the medication before they left. These were also individuals that had like big T traumas, surgery. These were not people who came in to have a tooth pulled. What happened after this 5-sentence letter was that the floodgates opened, and suddenly the thing which no one wanted to talk about had been said out loud. And it gave other people permission to start talking about maybe there was something we could do about pain in America. In 1995, the American Pain Management Society, those members of our medical community responsible for guiding us in this area, promoted a concept known as the 5th vital sign. And what they said was that pain is so important and there is so much we could do about it that when a patient comes in for health care, we should consider it to be as important as their blood pressure, their heart rate, their weight, those critical pieces of information that we gather at every encounter, that now we would be screening people and treating people for pain. It was 1995. 1 year later, Purdue Pharmaceuticals introduces Oxycontin. And they win an award, many awards. for how well they marketed OxyContin, for the sales of OxyContin in our communities. And in fact, in 1998, Purdue Pharmaceuticals offers your first script of OxyContin free. Now, in the United States, I cannot get the first prescription of antiretroviral living with HIV free, knowing that they are going to be on this medication the rest of their lives. But I can get you the first bottle of an opioid that you're not supposed to be on forever, and we'll give you that one for free. Between 1997 and 2002, OxyContin prescriptions rose from 670,000 to 6.2 million. That would not be the last time that those prescriptions make that kind of jump in the United States. And then Purdue uses speakers bureaus, and what they essentially do is they pay physicians to market the use of their drug for pain, arming them with a letter to the editor from the New England Journal of Medicine saying that it is safe to do this, with guidelines from the American Pain Management Society guiding them towards the algorithms that they needed for screening and ultimately for treatment. And now we have the pharmaceutical industry joining with the Institution of Medicine, flooding our communities with opioids. In 2000, the same American Pain Society, the president, proposes the pain as a vital sign concept at their general meeting, spreading this outside of even the pain management communities. And then in 2001, the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, our friends over at JACO, they make a statement that says, there is no evidence that addiction is a significant issue when persons are given opioids for pain control. That's JACO saying that. Not long after, the Federation of State Medical Boards and the Drug Enforcement Agency issue statements promising less regulatory scrutiny. So now we have the Institution of Medicine, the pharmaceutical industry, and now those bodies that are supposed to provide oversight, that are supposed to regulate these things, have now said, go forward. We think this is a good idea. This is what happened. This map shows you from 1999 to 2015 what occurred in the United States as the overdoses from opioids grew across the country. As a person from West Virginia who works at the national level, I can tell you I've been talking about this problem ever since I left West Virginia. That was many, many, many years ago. If you look at this map, you can see that bright red spot right there. That's us. It always has been here. And yet, even after we become aware of the problem with opioids, even after we're seeing this destroy communities, you can see that the problem, and by all indicators, it's not getting any better now. I can tell you I come up from space closer to New England where the fentanyl is coming through like rates we've never seen. An opiate overdose on something like heroin, we have a couple hours to give you Narcan. With fentanyl, we have a couple minutes. So I think you can see what's going to happen as soon as that stuff hits here. When you look at this map, it makes me angry because what I also know is that we blame the people who have this addiction, and yet I can trace back exactly how this started. This did not happen in the community. This did not happen because people were in despair or they were hopeless. This happened mostly because people were doing their work. They were going to a job that was very physical. They likely got hurt on that job. They were then mismanaged by a primary care physician who was doing exactly what the experts on their speakers bureaus told him or her to do. And then we left them in a landscape without health care and a serious addiction, and communities that don't understand what happened, who then demonize the user. That's stigma. That's what's happening in our communities right now. And the part that should make us super angry is that this was done to us. They knew what they were doing. They have the data inside the pharmaceutical industries that prove they were aware that the addictions were growing. They were aware that physicians were prescribing things that they should not be. And I think it's important to recognize, for those of you who don't know, opioids are no good for chronic pain at all. And yet they were being pushed out of our communities right into the hands of people who trusted the institution of medicine, who did exactly what their doctor told them. When I grew up in the town, it was your priest and your doctor, and probably your mother, right? She's the other person to kind of tell you what to do. In 2007, Purdue pleads guilty to the marketing of OxyContin, admitting that they did this, right? That's 2007. I just want to take you back to that map. It's right there, folks. They already knew what they were doing, and the problem got worse because they got to keep doing it. This morning, I was watching CBS with my mother, who's up in the audience. Hopefully, I'm doing her proud. And on there was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Robert Redfield, who was sharing the story of his son, who almost died of an opioid overdose. It is sitting in his home, in his family. And the statement that he made not too long ago was that it's important for society to embrace and support families who are fighting to win the battle of addiction, because stigma is the enemy of public health. I can tell you in almost every area of public health that I work in, stigma is an underlying current that is confounding our ability to retain people in care, to deliver needed care to folks, or even identify the people who need the care that we can provide. So we've got this thing sitting in our communities. We know that it's there. So what do we do about it? I'm a nerd. I was the little gay kid who was no good at sports. So I studied and read things. So when I first started hearing about stigma, I got to be honest, as a kid from West Virginia, I didn't think a whole lot about it because I pretty much felt like we were the ones that experienced it. I was the kid that had to drop his accent when I went to the big city so they wouldn't think I was stupid. I'm the kid that had to think about, whether I tell people where I'm from because they might treat me differently, thinking that nothing good comes out of West Virginia. So my experience of stigma was as a person who received it, who was stigmatized. So I didn't know a whole lot about it because I think when people are stigmatized, it's hard to see it. It's a lot like trauma. It can be affecting you and landing on you, but you are unaware of it. I think especially when we have a lens of white privilege, because stigma is not something that often happens to us. And I think that it is strange for us to sit in it when it does, which is why I think things like the opioid crisis are so confounding to us, because it is striking at the very heart of our understanding of our own privilege. So when I went to learn about this, I decided to start with definitions to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And what I found about stigma and discrimination is that at its core, stigma and discrimination is about othering people. It is about taking them from the safety and stability of society and putting them somewhere else. The other thing that's really terrible about stigma is that if an individual were to choose to speak up about this stigmatization happening, then they are likely to also be othered, to be picked up out of the group and sent over there. Because if you like those people so much, why don't you go hang out with them, right? The trick is, once you've sent people over there and they're no longer in the conversation, it then becomes super easy to blame them for everything that's happening in society, right? It's always their fault. And yet the they that we always talk about never seem to be at the table, never seem to be a part of the conversation. And yet they seem to have such incredible agency in our communities to destroy the very foundations of America. That's stigma. That's what it is. Communities are built on dialogue and conversation with one another. People ask me about the opioid epidemic. Is it gonna get better? And I think the greatest opportunity around this opioid epidemic is that to truly end it, it will require that our communities heal themselves from the inside out. I remember watching that documentary Heroin about Huntington, and the part that stunned me was a person who said, if you give me this Narcan, do I have to give it to them? And I thought, this is one thing if you're in New York City where there's a million faces that walk by you every day. This is Huntington, West Virginia. They likely know the person who they're talking about, school with them. That's probably the kid or a brother or a sister or a cousin of someone they know. And things are so bad, the stigma is so high that I'm willing to let someone I know that I grew up with die in front of me rather than give them life-saving medication. That's othering people at such an extreme level that you other them out of existence. This is a book I read when I was in college by a guy named Goffman. He's considered to be the grandfather of stigma. Pretty much anything you read about stigma is going to cite him. His definition is still the one commonly used today. This is his book entitled Stigma, Notes on the Management of a Spoiled Identity. If you have an interest in stigma or discrimination at all, I would highly recommend that you pick up this book. It is very short. It is not a difficult read. I'm a person that 2 pages, and I fall asleep and I'm done. This one I got through in a whole night. It is easily digested. The only thing I will tell you is Goffman was writing in the 1950s and 60s, so some of the stuff he says is pretty stigmatizing and racist. So you kind of have to let him sit in the time he was writing. But the framework that he has put forward is still the one that stigma researchers use today. And in this book, he identifies the types of stigma, how individuals deal with stigma, and how persons with a stigma relate to other people who he calls the normals. His definition of stigma is that stigma is an attribute that links a person to an undesirable stereotype, leading other people to reduce the bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted and discounted one. I can tell you, as a person who has experienced this, it feels as awful as it sounds to be tainted and discounted. This is something that many people in our communities walk with every day. These are the microaggressions that occur against people of color. These are the microaggressions that occur against women, things that we are not even aware of. And I can tell you, I'm a person that has had to realize a lot about the way I walked in the world and what I didn't see and what I've learned to see and what I've learned to say I'm sorry for in the past. Because once I realized what was happening around me and understood stigma and discrimination, it's kind of the veil has been lifted and you can see it everywhere. It's right in front of you. It is a very sort of human trait right now to push away that which we do not understand, that which seems weird, that which doesn't fit in our worldview. And at the end of the day, it's othering, right? You're putting them out. Goffman says there are two types of stigma, discredited and discreditable. A discredited stigma is one in which I can observe you, make a judgment, and stigmatize you. Often we think about race, ethnicity, gender expression, gender identity, all of these different areas where people have observational elements that we can sort of draw from. But there's also this other type of stigma, a discreditable stigma. And this is one that you can't necessarily perceive. This could be a person's sexual orientation. I know a lot of people are like, oh, especially even in the gay community, they're like, oh, I know who's gay. I have gaydar. And I got to remind people that that's like the biggest stereotype I've ever heard in my life, right? And so it doesn't shock me that people who are marginalized are now marginalizing each other using stereotypes. You can't tell, right? Some people might give symbols or tells that they're telling community members things about themselves, but I still have to disclose something to you for you to be able to make this judgment. HIV is another thing that's very much a discreditable stigma. We walk in the world as persons with HIV now with very effective medication, living lives longer, in fact, than people without HIV because we're in much better healthcare than the general American public. You can't tell that we're walking around with HIV. So there are things about people as they walk in the world that are holding on to them, that are causing negative sort of experiences in their world that we may not even be aware of, caught in what we can see, that sometimes we forget about the things that are underneath what we can see. It's that situation of the iceberg, right? Like I can see the top of it, but underneath it is this huge amount of information and data. Well, the discredited stigmas are just the top of the iceberg, right? We've got lots more that happens in this country at the discreditable stage that is far more insidious than some of the things that happen even explicitly. Goffman also says that for people who are stigmatized, it's as if they're constantly sitting on a stage, performing for the whole world, making sure that every move they make, everything they say, everything they do is measured, is calculated, is thought about, and in many ways is sometimes tactical. The reason for this is because many times communities who have told other communities about themselves have had that information used against them. That if I were to discuss what was happening in my space, it is lifted out of my name, reframed, and told to someone else. So for example, in HIV right now, we now know that individuals with an undetectable viral load are incapable of transmitting the virus sexually. The CDC has said it, the NIH has said it, the World Health Organization has said it, the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors have said it. But what's happened in the stage theory is that people with HIV have known for years that this was true and have been acting on this information much longer than science knew the research. When I was first diagnosed in 2005, I was pulled aside by old members of my community who said, if you want to make sure you never give this to anyone, always take your meds. That's the trick. That was 2005. That's community experience. Community experience can be highly valuable in understanding how healthcare plays out. But I think you can imagine why a bunch of gay men living with HIV were not readily telling the communities that they were having condomless sex because of what would have happened to them, what would have been said about them. And yet, heterosexual individuals living or not living with HIV have condomless sex all the time. All the time. No one ever blames them. No one ever says they have a death wish, right? This is stigma, right? This is why communities don't talk about what's happening. And what he says, though, is that communities do talk about what's happening, just not while they're on the stage. They go to the backstage. And in the backstage, there are two groups of people. One group called the own. These are people who possess the same kinds of stigma, and the whys. The whys are people who have offered their support, and that support has been accepted. It is very important to understand lots of people want to help other people, but sometimes other people don't want to be helped, or they don't want you to help them. And that is fine. We are right to sit in our rights and say, I want to determine for myself in community with people like me how we are going to talk about ourselves before we step out into the world and let a majority conversation define us. Because communities have to have that safe space in order to have those discussions. Outside of the backstage, you have in the audience what Goffman refers to as the normals. And these are the folks who do not possess that stigma. That's what I mean a little bit like a stigmatizing language, as if people who are not normal are abnormal. We've kind of blown up that paradigm a little bit and talk about it in a very different way, but it kind of gives you a sense of the way he's thinking about the ordinary understanding. The other thing that Goffman identifies in his book are these sort of signs that people are coping with a stigma, how they sort of walk in the world as a tell of what's happened to them. The first one he talks about is that some stigmatized people can attempt to physically remove their stigma. So an example could be a survivor of intimate partner violence who bears a scar on his or her face, so that as they're walking through the world every day, when people look at the scar, they may not know where that scar comes from, but the person who has it does. And when they see people look at them, it's a constant reminder of what happened. It's a constant reminder of powerlessness potentially, or of an event that they would like to process, put in its place, and move on. But they've got this thing sitting there. Well, we now have options where we could remove that physical scar. It doesn't take the event away, but what it does do is it moves that stigma from a discredited one to a discreditable one that the person can walk in the world without the observation in front of them. Another thing folks can do is master the areas that stigmatize them. Last time I was here, I told this story, and it's still, I think, the best one. David Sedaris is an author. He writes these really kind of dark and twisted, funny books about being a young gay kid in North Carolina. While he was there as a kid, he had a lisp, and he was identified as a kid with a speech impediment, and that he needed to go see a speech therapist. That's what you would do, right? So he goes to the speech therapist, and what he discovers is that he starts noticing that there's a certain kind of kid that goes to speech therapist, and those kids did not play football or basketball, and that he finally ended up by saying they should have just written "Future Homosexuals of America" on the door, called it a day, and it would be fine. He stopped going because he didn't want people to know that he was gay, and he thought going to speech therapy was a tell that he was gay. So instead, as a kid, he learns words that don't have the letter S in them so that he doesn't have to use language that tells you he has a lisp, that then tells you he needs speech therapy, that then tells you he's gay. Think about the mechanics a kid has to go through, right, just to avoid this process. And then he takes that huge vocabulary that he has, flips it around, and ends up becoming a $1 million author, right? Traveling the world, telling people about these experiences being this funny, awkward gay kid avoiding speech therapy in North Carolina. But at the end of the day, what happened there is that you had a kid who had a speech impediment that could probably be fixed, that didn't get it fixed because there was some barrier to them even walking into the door to receive that health care because of the stigma and discrimination around how people think gay men talk, right? Something so simple as that gets in a kid's head and they avoid health care, right? Another one here is that stigmatized persons can come to view their stigma as a blessing. This is one that's really common in the HIV community. I heard this a lot when I first was diagnosed. People saying to me, oh, thank God for HIV, or I would be dead on the street. I would have died of an overdose. I was homeless, and it was HIV that woke me up and got me back into my life. And at first I thought, wow, that's really fantastic. You know, for people to have these transformative experiences. I was studying behavioral health. I was like, oh, there we go, moment of change. We can do all this stuff. And then the more I thought about it, and the more I traveled and talked to communities about what was happening to them, the more I realized that that's a really messed up thing. Because what they're essentially saying is that it is better in the United States of America to get a potentially chronic, fatal disease than it is to have an addiction or to be homeless. Because if you get HIV, we can treat that. We know what to do. And maybe you getting HIV will wake you up enough that the rest of the problems will be solved because we don't know what to do with you as an active drug user. So as I sat with that, trying to think about what it means to be grateful for having HIV, and I think that that is less something I need to work out in the heads of my community and something more that the institution of medicine needs to sit with for a while and ask ourselves why addicts would get HIV to get better. Another thing that Goffman says is that people with a stigma can essentially go to reassess the limits of the normal. So these are the folks not possessing the stigma. So as a kid, my father, gay man, wasn't out when we were kids, kind of maybe out now. But he worked at Union Carbide Corporation because we're in West Virginia, right? Where do you work? Coal mine or the factory? So working at Union Carbide, shift supervisor, gay man, gets caught coming out of a gay bar, gets fired, right? This is in the 80s. You could do that all the time. Still can, actually. So as kids, that's kind of rough, right? Your dad loses his job, but you don't really understand why. The whole community does. Everybody's whispering about it. You hear pieces of it, but you don't have the story. Well, kids do what kids are really good at doing. They bounce back. They revalue their family. They try to think about themselves in a different light. So as young kids, I remember when all that happened and we were like, okay, so dad's kind of gay. What does that mean? And we were like, got it. You know whose Easter outfits were really cute when they were kids? Ours. Do you know why? My dad sewed them and they were matching. The other thing I went to was other kids' houses and I was like, this house, there's just really not a color pattern here. The windows look terrible. And I don't know who picked out that couch, but she should be fired. And then all I would say is, of course, we don't have that problem at my house. Because my dad, he's got the window treatments down. We go to furniture market as kids, and I know how to match any pattern. And the only reason you sort of do that, right, is because you don't know what to do. You don't know how to handle the fact that what's happening to you. So you revalue who you are and the people around you so that it can make sense for you. So that you don't walk in the world as a kid who's ashamed of their parent because of something their community is judging them for. Right? He walked out of a gay bar, lost his job. It affected our whole family. It affected our whole community around how that happened. All because some people didn't want to work with a fag. Right? This is still very real in our communities. They also have this thing about stigmatized folks finally decide, I don't even want to be around you anymore. Right? Why would I want to hang around with a bunch of people who don't like me? It makes me not like you either. Right? So here's the easy answer. Let's get tribal. I don't have to live near you. I'm going to go live where I want to live, around the people that I know who think the way I do, act the way I do, and I'm done with you. So when I went to DC and I found DuPont Circle, if you've ever been there, now I was from Hurricane. The internet was not around when I was a kid. I did not know that there were gay people, much less neighborhoods of gay people. So when I got to DuPont Circle, I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. It's a whole neighborhood of gay people. But what I didn't know was who was that neighborhood before they were a neighborhood of gay people. And so when you dig down, it's not pretty. Like most gentrification in this country, that was a community of people of color that had lower property values because they were devalued at being a community of color. And the gay white people who didn't want to live near the straight white people because they thought they were mean and nasty went over here, pushed out the communities of color, established these beautiful gay neighborhoods, but nobody ever thought about then what happened to the people they displaced out of that neighborhood. You can go into DC now and you can see new metro spurs. The reason they built those metro spurs was because they gentrified the people of color out of the city and there was no one to work in the shops anymore. So they had to figure out a way to bus the people of color back in from the Maryland counties so that someone would be able to serve the white people in Georgetown. The last thing that people with a stigma can do is seek out sympathetic others. When you are constantly being told that the world is bad because of you, that it is your fault, that your action or inaction, simply your existence in the world, is the breaking apart the very foundation, you seek out people who don't think that. People who are going to support you, allies. I work a lot with the trans community right now, and they're very vocal about telling people that allyship is a verb. It is not a concept. It is something you do. It is something you take action on. So I want to talk a little bit about how we take action on some things by illuminating what it looks like as like a little bit of a case study with what we deal with in HIV. In HIV, we used to focus solely on the HIV, and what we discovered was that that was the wrong thing to do. That in fact, we were facing a syndemic, that there were multiple epidemics occurring at the same time that were influencing each other, leveraging things all around, that made it impossible to see this separated from other issues. So we began to dive in thinking about what does stigma look like in a syndemic? What is the intersectionality of this moment? And what we started with was we got to attack these three things: substance use, mental health, and HIV. And each one of those are highly stigmatized conditions. So we dropped in and we took a look at each one of them to kind of illuminate, what does this look like? What are the health outcomes? People say it all the time. Stigma affects healthcare. Great. But as a person who believes strongly in data, as a person who believes strongly in science, you got to tell me how. How is it affecting healthcare? What parts of stigma are affecting it? Because otherwise, how am I designing any kind of intervention in order to mitigate or address the stigma in the environment? There was not a whole lot of data about stigma and HIV a couple years ago, but what there were significant amounts of data around stigma in mental health and substance use. So I want to take just a cursory moment to educate you a little bit, if you don't already know, about what it's like to have a mental illness in the United States. 1 in 5 persons in the United States are believed to be living with a diagnosable mental health condition, right? Diagnosable mental health disorder. That's 20%, 1 in 5, count in this room, right? I guarantee you not all of us are seeking the care that we probably should. And then what happens is we have an estimated lost productivity due to untreated serious mental illness of $193 billion annually. Now tell me anything else in this country that we would be spending $193 billion on that we would just let go without having a conversation about. And this is just by not treating people that need help. We also know that the stigma associated with mental health disorders can actually be more damaging than the mental health disorder itself, can do more harm, has more physical outcomes. And then here's the other part that just makes me, I just don't know what you do. Mental health professionals will not even go to seek mental health treatment themselves, right? So they're like, please come step into our system that even I won't go to. Oh, well, that sounds fantastic. I can't wait to walk in the door of that, right? And I can tell you, I've walked in the doors of the mental health systems in this country, and I walked back out all 3 times. And then I flew to the jungles of South America, and I yelled at trees that symbolize my father, and I got better. Right? It's not always a pill, kids. And so at the end of the day, these are not systems that are healing people right now, right? These are not systems that people are walking into. And I don't think it's because doctors and nurses and the healthcare system are evil. I'm a quality guy. A system is bad, not people. But there is something about the system and the way we think about mental illness that is keeping people from walking in the doors. And I think it's illuminated a little bit in this last point, which is in this survey, 57% of all adults believe that they were caring and compassionate to persons with a mental illness. Yet when you ask persons with mental health symptoms, only 25% of them believe that people were kind and caring and compassionate to them. So there's a disconnect between how people are being treated and how we think we're actually treating people. And it's that intersection that I'm most interested in, because I think that's where medicine sits in almost every single example I've seen. People are unaware of what they're doing. They think that it's the right thing to say. They use language that is really offensive, but they don't know that because they haven't been taught that. We expect people to know things that they weren't taught. We expect them to have scoured the corners of the internet like we do, and they don't. They scour the internet for the things that are relevant to them, and my identity is probably not one of them, right? When you also look at stigma and mental health, we also know people with mental illness are more likely to experience housing and employment discrimination and homelessness. They are more likely to be counseled to accept jobs for which they are overqualified, which is probably how they end up having problems paying for things. And they are at a higher risk of victimization and experience unfair treatment by authorities when they try to report things happening to them. The other thing that's really critical to understand about the flow of mental illness in this country is the relationship that it has with our prison and jails. This country has a pendulum that swings back and forth. We like to empty our jails and fill our prisons, and empty our prisons and fill our hospitals, and empty the hospitals, back to the jails, back to the prisons, circle people through, deciding where we think the best place to put people with a mental illness are. You can see this all over the country. It happens regularly in communities. And right now, we have in most US states, more people with mental illness in prisons and jails than we do in psychiatric hospitals. Our police force is right to be upset that they are the largest providers of mental health care in this country right now, because that's where we have shifted the problem. When I spoke to some people down in Huntington, they were telling me that they were training 911 callers to do case management. Who calls so frequently to 911 that the 911 operator is your case manager, right? That says there is something happening in our communities that is not meeting this need. The other thing we know about mental health and stigma is that it reduces resilience. The very thing you need to get back up is the very thing that stigma tears down. So it is pulling the foundation out from under the people, literally as they're building it. So all of those times when you're like, I just wish they'd get their life back together, they probably are trying really damn hard to get their life back together. But this kind of stuff keeps happening to them. I watched a family friend come home. Horrible things happen. He did a terrible, terrible thing to people in his family. Violent, physical, people were hurt. He came in from his first month in AA with a chip. He was so excited about it. Everyone thought it was really awkward that he brought that chip up at Christmas because it reminded them of what happened and they didn't want to talk about it. I watched him fall apart inside in that very moment. The moment where we should have been so happy and dropped everything to support this guy having made 1 month sober, and we didn't because it was uncomfortable. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, right? It's not that you're walking around saying people with a mental illness are terrible people. You don't have to be that explicit. You just have to demonstrate through your behavior that you don't care. When you look at substance use, unfortunately, it doesn't get much better. Research shows that stigma associated with substance use disorders leads to a host of problems, including poor physical and mental health, non-completion of substance use treatment. They stop going, right? When you got everybody around you not believing that you can do anything, then why do you believe that you can do anything? I also was recently at a federal meeting where we were trying to talk about the opioid crisis, and one of your resident physicians here, Dr. Judith Feinberg, gave probably the best answer I've ever heard. When they said, what is causing this problem? She said, hopelessness, economic despair. That's what's going on here. People do not perceive that if they do anything, it will even get better, right? That's a narrative that's trapped in our communities, and we can help people get out of that. But we have to support them through the process. We also know that stigma will delay their recovery and reintegration processes. They're afraid to talk about what happened to them, what they went through. We see the same kind of thing on the trauma side of the equation too. People not wanting to talk about this because society doesn't know what happened. So we have generations of soldiers who come back and become alcoholics because the only people they know how to talk to are the other guys who were there with them. So they sit in the bar and they drink because that's where they can process what's gone on. And you can look at every war this country has had, and this is a pattern. And not only that, at every war we had, we invented a better opiate to treat them. Think about these things, right? We also know that persons with substance use disorders are the most highly stigmatized of just about any of the stigmas out there in healthcare. It is accepted, culturally endorsed, and enshrined in our policy to stigmatize and discriminate against drug users. We consider it to be more of a moral failure and a criminal issue than we do about being sickness, illness, right? That's what addiction is, right? It's not, again, it's not like people were sitting around and they had nothing better to do and they wanted a heroin addiction, right? Things happened in people's worlds. And the other thing we know is that healthcare providers hold negative attitudes about substance users. They think they clog up the system, right? Oh, if we open a medication-assisted therapy program, well, then we're going to have those people in our waiting room. I had to remind people, those people are already in your flipping waiting room. And they're clogging up your EDs. They're in all of your systems right now. They're probably the people yelling at your receptionist, causing all the problems. And it's because you're not caring for them. Plain and simple. Everyone says, when a patient comes in yelling on a scale of 0 to 10, how are you today? And they tell you they're a 13 and they're screaming, that didn't just happen that day. This has been taught. This is lived experience. It means that every time I've walked in your system, I've had to get to a 13 to get what I need done. So I'm not gonna go through 1 through 12 anymore, because that wastes my time and it wastes yours. I'm gonna go to a 13. And that's how we end up saying, God, these people, they're so awful. Well, yeah, imagine being a person so desperate whose family and everything is being taken from them, seeking help, and the people you're seeking help from blaming you for the thing you're seeking help for. You choose not to go back. When we look at HIV, this just confounds it. Stigma and discrimination, we know, play significant roles in HIV care. Our national HIV/AIDS strategy has identified them as things that must be mitigated in order for the HIV epidemic to end in this country. We have highly effective antiretroviral therapy that will bring a person with a detectable viral load to undetectable, often within 2 to 3 weeks. Very few side effects, a whole system that puts the money out there to pay for this medication. And we only have 50% of the persons living with HIV in this country virally suppressed. Free healthcare, free medical case management, free medication, and they're not walking in the door. And that's because of stigma and discrimination. Only it's not always about HIV, because the HIV stigma can be confounded by the identities that walked in the door before HIV. When I walked in the door as a person with HIV, I was also walking in the door as a homeless kid. I was walking in the door as a commercial sex worker. I was walking in the door as an injection drug user. And I was walking in the door as an independent party enhancement coordinator, was my official business title. And they had to take account for all of those things, because I thought you looked at me like a drug user and a prostitute and a homeless person, and all of those things are playing in my head. The last thing I was thinking about was HIV. And it was the first thing they were thinking about. And there was a disconnect between what was important to me and what was important to them. And all they knew was that they had a drugged out homeless kid in there. And you can imagine the kind of care I got from the first system I went to when I didn't know how to advocate for myself. I sat on a hospital gurney for almost 6 hours. I had pain in my teeth. I was a meth addict. Of course I did. I went in. I said, I've got pain in my tooth. It's really hurting. My teeth are cracking out of my head. They let me sit on that gurney for hours. I could hear them saying, let's see how long he waits, right? Because if he's really in pain, he'll wait. And in my head, I'm like, you don't know jack about drugs, because no meth addict is sitting here waiting for Percocets, right? Like, different drug. I'm an uppers girl. That's a downer. And they just didn't understand. Finally, this gay nurse comes walking by, and he looks at me and he says, are you still here? And I said, yeah, I'm still here. And he's like, we're going to get you out of here. He said, these people are not going to help you, just so you know. So I got up out of there, and I got to tell you, because of that moment, I didn't go back into care for almost 3 years. And now, 10 years later, I'm slowly losing every tooth in my head, because those people couldn't see past the drug use right in front of them. So I can imagine, being kids familiar with West Virginia, how that is going to drop in the rooms that I'm walking in as the former meth addict from West Virginia losing his teeth. Right? It shouldn't matter, but it's gonna. Right? Those are things that I'm going to walk with. And you need to understand the people you're helping and serving are potentially walking with these things too, even if you don't see it on them. We know that stigma can lead to many negative consequences for people living with HIV, including their own suicide. Right? There are high rates of suicide in people with HIV, even higher in our transgender communities, and particularly high in our trans women of color, who are killing themselves at a rate of 50%. When we went to identify what could we do about HIV-related stigma, the research showed us something quite interesting, and that was evidence suggested that HIV and AIDS-related stigma were far less varied and context-specific than we had imagined. We were awful to people in the same way, no matter where in the world we went. We were like, great. Well, that makes it easy to target, because what it tells us is that there is something about our humanity that is generating this stigma, something about inside of us, the way we feel about things. Otherwise, you would see variation. You would expect to see this happen differently, and it doesn't. It happened in the same way. We also know that people in parts of the world and even parts of this country are just as terrified of people living with HIV as they are with somebody who would walk in with Ebola, because they know that little about the disease. We also know that the root causes of our stigma, when we found it, simple. I don't think this is going to shock anybody. Knowledge. It was a lack of knowledge that led to fear, and fear-based messaging complicated our prevention and care treatments, right? Whenever I say something's weird, I catch myself. I had a professor in college use that word. He said, anytime you say something is weird, it's because you don't understand it and you need to go learn something about it. And I think a lot of people think the stuff with HIV, stuff around gender identity, all the other stuff we ask people to understand about communities that puts them at risk for HIV, they don't get it because it's weird. And it's weird because they don't know about it. It's a lack of knowledge. Knowledge leads to fear. Fear leads to crappy messages. The other thing that we found was morality. And I don't mean like, this is not in the churchy sense. This is this implication of what they call the karma effect. That there's this underlying belief in our various cultures that good things happen to good people, so therefore bad things happen to bad people. And nobody would argue that HIV is good, so therefore HIV must be bad and the people with it must be bad. And when you think that way, what ends up happening is you're able to create this continuum that the researchers built because you blame people for being sick, right? And when I look at this continuum, the only thing I don't see on here is the United States government, who for 10 years said nothing about this disease when they knew it was ravaging in this country. When we want to talk about the locus of guilt, there are plenty of people that we could line up and talk about. But to talk about people living with HIV as being guilty for getting sick is as dumb as talking about people with diabetes being guilty, right? It's something that happens. There are things and dynamics in our communities that are outside sometimes of people's control. What you see here, though, take a look at where women land. If you're men's property, right, then you're a little bit less guilty. Women who get HIV from their husbands, we say they infected her, removing all agency any woman might have, right, that she's now owned by her husband. Except if she's unmarried, then it's fully her responsibility and we hold her entirely accountable, more so than we do men. And I had to say, as a man, I fully expected to see us fully guilty. So it shocked me to be right in the middle, but we see what it is, which is that we treat unmarried women even worse. And that's especially when you go globally. In fact, some parts of the world, to be diagnosed with HIV removes your sense of womanhood. You are removed from the structures of womanhood. You are no longer allowed to participate in the culture and the community as you would as a woman. You have been removed and othered. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this. This is called the Health Policy Project. It is probably the most comprehensive toolkit I've ever seen related to mitigating stigma and discrimination. It specifically relates to HIV, but they absolutely address substance use, women, mental illness, commercial sex work, LGBTQ issues. They hit it all. What they give you are 3 steps. You have to assess the facility that you're working in. They have a validated instrument that is in multiple languages that hits all of these topics. So that if you're working on stigma, you're working on the problem that's really there and not the problem that you think is there, right? There's nothing worse than working on problems you don't have. And people do that in medicine all the time. Once you've assessed the environment and you know where your pain points are, then you need to train your staff. They need to understand. They need to get out of that lack of knowledge place and step into the place of information. And then lastly, you have to sustain all of these efforts. And the sustaining of these efforts is mainly achieved through these steps. But I want to particularly draw your attention to step, develop and launch a code of conduct. At the end of the day, stigma and discrimination are felt in the way we behave towards others. If it is unacceptable to discriminate against people, to stigmatize others, then it needs to be in your code of conduct and you need to be enforcing it. And that's the sticking point. Nobody wants to enforce it because it's always a big name on campus. It's always a big person who says the thing that no one is supposed to say. And then we bow to the power, we give in to the privilege, and say that it is okay to say these things. And our silence makes consent. It is not okay for people to say these things. It is not okay to sit in silence while it happens. That's what perpetuates it. If you want to end stigma and discrimination in your community, you'll say something about it when you see it. If you see someone discriminating against a trans woman, point it out. You don't have to call them out. They have a whole model of calling people in. It's very different. You can do it. But I can tell you, I do the same thing for you every time I'm sitting at a federal meeting and they start talking about people from West Virginia. I stand up. It's uncomfortable to tell people they're discriminating that way. But I do it because they are, because it's the right thing to do. And I think as medical professionals, it's part of your job. It's part of your duty, because what I'm telling you is that this physically and mentally harms people. So if you're stigmatizing people, you're going against the very thing that we're all here to do, which is make people better, to bring them to wellness, to give them the agency they need to achieve the life they want. So at the end of the day, the question is, how do we start, right? Racism's huge. Homophobia is huge, right? I think at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, I'm from quality management space, and our motto is, what can you do by next Tuesday? If you can't do it by next Tuesday, you're thinking too big, and that's why it's so hard to get to an action point. If you can sit down with somebody in your class, one of your professors, if you're in a student organization, or if you're part of one of the departments you work, can you talk to somebody about what are we doing about stigma and discrimination in our space? What are we doing about diversity and inclusion? How can we bring more diverse voices in? Are we doing everything that we could to change our way of thinking, knowing that the way we think is harming our communities? I can always have a conversation by next Tuesday. You got 7 days from now to decide what can you do. But at the end of the day, again, when we say allyship is a verb, this is about taking action. It will not work if you simply know that it's wrong and say nothing when you see it. You have to stand up, however uncomfortable it may be. We have a long history in this country of that. We call it a profile in courage. So the last thing I would tell you all to do, professionals, study hard, keep working on these systems, but above all, be courageous. Stand up for what you know to be right. And at the end of the day, I think your patients will thank you for it. So thank you all for letting me come. It was great to be here. There were like 20 different things. Did they email it back? They lost it.